Welcome back to Spiritual Storytelling, and I am more than excited to be here with you today for a deep dive into a story that hinges on liminality. So today we're going to focus less on personal wounds and a little more on cultural, ancestral, kind of inherited wounds. We're going to zoom out. We're going to take this time in between to embrace a new and wider perspective. I also want to note that I'll be talking about feminine and masculine representations today, as they're symbolized in nature, but I want to note that I'm speaking metaphorically, that these are elements on a spectrum of gender that we all fall on somewhere. So no matter where this is for you, I want you to know that you are welcome and included in this space. So if you heard the last update, you'll know that I'm shifting thematically for a little while into stories that are comfortable with ambiguity. The first in this collection is one of my absolute favorites because it touches on so many different aspects of humanness without really being about just one or another. It's a story that resists a single moralistic reading. And this alone makes it an appropriate starting point for our new endeavor, but there's so many aspects of this story itself that live in liminality. So science fiction as a genre asks us to think about what it really means to be human. It wants us to explore where in our humanness does our humanity lie. This is an important question and one that we'll return back to at the end of the episode, so keep it in mind. With that said, what better story to use than the OG science fiction novel, Frankenstein? So Frankenstein is such a masterpiece because of the creative ingenuity that it employed at the time that it was written. So you have to understand that the world was a very different place in 1817. There was a lot that we were only beginning to understand about the human body and the limits of scientific knowledge. The natural world was a thing we were really hungry to understand, and we just didn't yet. There were still so many things that were just a total mystery to us. Benjamin Franklin had successfully flown his little key kite thing in 1752, but the light bulb was still a long way off. So we're waking up to these forces around us, and we were culturally in a liminal state of intellectual awareness. The Industrial Revolution had changed everything in 1760, but these new inventions were still kind of working their way into everyday life. Emanuel Swedenborg and Franz Mesmer had been blurring the lines between science and God, and we were just waking up to the possibilities around us. It was a time for dreamers. With so much yet to discover about ourselves and the world, we were uniquely in a place to believe that anything was possible. And this is where Mary Shelley's ingenuity lies. So I'm going to summarize the story as briefly as possible, because with the cinematic legacy it has, I know y'all are thinking of Young Frankenstein, and that just is not it. So I want to make sure we're all on the same page. It's really important also to remember that there's never one reading, one meaning to a story. This is just a lens that we can look through to see something new about ourselves and the world around us. If y'all are interested in working with other themes in this story, such as the role language and environment plays on our behavior, or a closer examination with an eye for biblical references, please let me know. I need to know what you guys think. If you like this, if you want to do more with it, if you want to move on, let me know. And before one of y'all come for me, this is a retelling that omits a ton of the story. This is a whole novel, and it's very rich. So I summarizing it in a few minutes is just really hard. And I also need to stick to what's most relevant to the reading that we're going to talk about today. So our story begins with a letter from R. Walton to his sister, where he recounts his journey into the Arctic and his newfound friend. The two met when Victor Frankenstein was stranded at sea, and the vessel that Walton was traveling on rescued him from the freezing waters. Frankenstein recounts his story, as Walton then describes it in writing to his sister. Victor explains that he was a college student who, after having been imbued with a fervent longing to penetrate the secrets of nature, decided to point his studies towards creating life from death. He isolated himself and worked fervently to create a new creature, one animated from dead flesh. When his dream is realized, however, he flees from the creature in horror, and it is released into the world. Frankenstein is traumatized by the hideousness of his child. Much later, he is confronted with this creature and begins threatening to destroy him. The creature speaks eloquently and pleads for kindness. He exclaims to him,
"I am thy creature, and I will be even mild and docile to my natural lord and king, if thou wilt also perform thy part, which thou owest me. O Frankenstein, be not equitable to every other, and trample upon me alone, to whom thy justice, and even thy clemency and affection is most due. Remember, I am thy creature. I ought to be thy Adam, but rather I am the fallen angel, whom thou drivest from joy for no misdeed. Everywhere I see bliss, from which I alone am irrevocably excluded. I was benevolent and good. Misery made me a fiend."
The creature continues on to tell its life story, one that reflects sensitivity, curiosity, compassion, and empathy. He comes to understand humans' abhorrence for him, as well as the utter abandonment of his creator. He realizes the extent of his aloneness, the depth of his unbelonging. He, like his creator, comes to realize that knowledge, once possessed, can do permanent damage on the seeker. Despite multiple attempts to help humans, he is detested at every turn, chased away, and even shot because of his hideousness. He turns on humanity and kills Victor's brother in a fit of rage. He regrets his violence terribly and begs Victor to create a mate for him, to which he eventually agrees. The monster is overjoyed at the prospect of having someone to share his life with, and tells Victor he will check in on his progress. Victor is traumatized by his first creation, and he's really hesitant to begin work on a second. He is betrothed to the love of his life and wants to be rid of the monster as quickly as he can. So he goes to England to begin this gruesome process, all the while having lots of second thoughts. One night, when he is assembling his new creation, he sees his monster staring into the window at him. In a fit of terror and rage, he destroys his work in progress. He tells Walton, "The wretch saw me destroy the creature on whose future existence he depended on for happiness," and, with a howl of devilish despair and revenge, withdrew. The creature dares Victor to go back on his word, claiming that he will seek horrible revenge. He tells Victor that he will be with him on his wedding night. Victor is racked with anxiety as his wedding approaches, and he's always looking over his shoulder and anticipating a fight to the death. When the night finally comes, he sends his wife to bed, hoping that she will be safely out of the way when the confrontation comes. Not long after, he hears her screams and realizes that this was the monster's intentions all along. He then sets out to exact his revenge, where eventually he happens upon Walton and his ship. Victor is emaciated from his prolonged travel and dies soon after giving his account. Walton later hears horrible moans and is confronted with Victor's creature, who regrets using his life for violence and proclaims that now that his master is dead, he wants to die too, and he disappears into the Arctic wilderness. So I just want you to bookmark something before we start breaking everything down. The fact that this story is framed by the Arctic is relevant. It is definitely relevant. And I think we're going to do a later episode on how the Arctic and Antarctic regions kind of played on the minds of writers of this era. So just keep that in mind. I think ultimately this story touches a lot on the desecration of the feminine, but I think it also confounds nature and women in the same space. So we're going to break that down. In reanimating dead flesh, Frankenstein is simultaneously bypassing nature's role and women's role in creating life. Nature and woman become somewhat synonymous both in the text but also in our cultural understanding. We've often associated the earth or nature with all things feminine. There's a reason why we call her Mother Earth. We talk about nature with very gendered language, and there is historical precedent for it in the ancient polytheistic religions that once defined human life. Women were seen as embodied representations of the earth, in which the seed was planted, the soil that nourished it into new life. She was represented alongside man in the natural world, and this represented every aspect of human life. When monotheistic religion took over, the role of the female became even more entwined with that of the earth. Women, like the natural world, were seen as God's gift to man to rule and preside over. These stories suggest that Earth was a place created for humanity, like a perfectly constructed sandbox that had food and plenty built in, just as woman was made as a helper for man, an accessory for him to utilize. Sarah Milner Berry puts it beautifully when she says, "Looking for justification as humanity began asserting its dominance over the earth in earnest, Western patriarchal societies saw an immediate connection between nature and the qualities which they had come to expect in a woman. The devaluation of both women and the environment was reified in language, leading to terms like virgin earth, fertile land, and barren soil, which we continue to use today." So this language really makes you curious. I mean, you kind of have to ask yourself, why we prize so highly that which is untouched by us? And do we see our hands as so dirty, so shameful, that with one touch we defile what we admire? So coming back around, if nature equates to woman, then science must therefore equate to man. As the story of Frankenstein and his monster unfold, we begin to see the trouble with subjugating the natural world to our whims. Another correlation between masculinity and science becomes apparent in the story. As we look a little deeper, we see it reflected in the attitudes in the world around it. Women have always been relegated to being emotional, whereas men have been prized as logical. Being creatures that seem to crave dualistic black and white thinking, it's clear that if that which is emotional, intuitive, and of the earth is in essence feminine, then that which is logical, precise, and of the mind is masculine. Even today, there are large gender gaps in STEM fields, owing largely to these deeply subconscious attitudes. The language that Frankenstein uses alludes to this dichotomy. Victor says at one point that he wants to penetrate into the recesses of nature and show how she works in her hiding places. And then turns around to revere the scientists who have, quote, partially unveiled the face of nature, although her lineaments were still a mystery. Maybe I'm just down a rabbit hole here, but these statements honestly give me like really rapey vibes. So this ultimately brings us to the need for compassion. So by bypassing nature, Frankenstein, and the masculine science that he stands for, is also bypassing the feminine. If we look back to the feminine representations of Earth, she is the vessel, the dirt that accepts the seed and nourishes it into life. When we bypass her role, we are left with a world that lacks acceptance, compassion, and nurturing. After all, was it not the destruction of woman that ultimately led to both the downfall of the monster and his maker? Was it not the utter lack of receiving, of nurturing, of compassion that caused such rage and violence? Like, what happens when this poor creature has, like, a face that only a mother could love and literally has no mother? When we sidestep our mother in figurative and literal terms, we are severing our own innate sense of belonging. We are tearing ourselves to pieces, preferring to make sense of the shards rather than being awed by the whole. So, what does all this have to do with healing? The fundamental assumption of questions like, what does it mean to be human? The questions that we asked before, that science fiction evokes in us. The fundamental assumption of these questions lies in our seeing ourselves as both separate from and superior to the natural world. We have created societies on systems that alienate us both from the natural world and from the feminine elements within ourselves that we think nature resembles. We assume that we are other than nature, that at best we can live alongside the land, when in reality we are of the land. We are of the earth, of the mother. Part of the reason why we are so uncomfortable with the liminal, that is to say, uncomfortable with the unknown, the unspecified, the paradoxical, is because we have developed this precise need for analytical sense. We need the pieces of the world to fit inside of a box that we have compartmentalized it to, including ourselves and others. We've developed medicine, science, reason, and social expectation with a hierarchy that prizes masculinity and its assumed natural properties at the top. To this day, we tend to laugh off anything that falls outside the strict confines of logic and masculinity. Just to give you a few examples, the prevalence of biblical literalism tells us that according to our hierarchy, religious texts must be the literal truth if they are to maintain their importance in our life. They must be analytically and scientifically factual to have value. If you have gained anything from any of the episodes of this podcast so far, you might come to see that this is not the case. Also, women are still seen as emotional and often illogical, while men are expected to be stoic or angry, but certainly never fearful, sad, or anxious. But the CDC says that suicide is the second most likely cause of death for men ages 20 to 44. Homicide is the third. And lastly, we see in the workplace all the time that it is culturally unacceptable to make your life revolve around your creative and emotional wellness instead of the other way around. In fact, in our society, it's pretty much impossible. So that's to say that Frankenstein is our legacy. It is what has become of those parts of us that we so eagerly shame and put away. We see them as terrifying and ugly only because we have been taught to see them that way. When we sit with ourselves, when we lean into our emotions, our confusions, our questions, we can see, like Victor might have seen in his creation, how delightfully human they are, how deserving of life and compassion they are. So what can we do? Lean into divine belonging. Accept that by being a child of this earth, you are inherently and infinitely emotional, creative, and connected to the world around you. Your ancestral inheritance, your source, is the chaos of the hurricane, the blooming of the lily, the heat of the wildfire, and the release of the rain. You are all this and more, and not allowing yourself the sacred right to take up space, to grow and release and weep and burn, is to live as a dead man reanimated. Until we embrace all of ourselves and tear down the confines of shame that continuously separate us from ourselves, from our beginning and ending, we cannot discover our potential. We must lean into compassion for all of ourselves and others. The authors of In the House of the Moon put it beautifully when they said, "When we ravage the earth, raping and plundering her resources, we sever our own lifeline to the future and cut ourselves off from the ultimate source of healing and wholeness. When we divide humanity into two unequal halves, disparaging one half as less trustworthy, intelligent, and spiritually advanced, We cleave our own souls in two. For what we do to each other, we do to ourselves. What we do to the earth, we do to our own souls. Everything in life is connected, and when any part is cut off or broken apart, the whole feels the insult and must struggle to maintain balance and harmony. So when we begin to allow space for the things in all of us that have been severed from us, those things in which we cannot prove or see or quantify, we can catch a glimpse of wholeness. Things like dreams, creativity, intuition, and emotion can pull us into sacred embrace with all that we are. When we remember that we belong to and with the ground beneath our feet, we can free ourselves of the existential shame of not being X or Y. When we embrace the lineage we have at our fingertips, a world of rushing water, expansive root systems, fury and fertility, sun and moon, we realize that home is all around us. We, just by living and breathing, are in sacred belonging with the natural world around us. Find some time in your day to lean into your inner wilderness. Read fiction, write badly, sing and dance, and release shame. When you feel the need to dismiss, shut down, push out, or distract, instead, pause. Sit with whatever it is, even if just for a moment. Open yourself up to the creative expressions inherent in you and embody what it could mean to be truly human. My sources for today's episode will be linked below, and if you heard something that resonated, share with your friends or your family, or let me know what you think. Feedback is a fundamental piece in a project like this, because honestly, talking into a microphone in my closet starts to get a little bit weird. If you liked our intro, check out more by Esther Garcia Gonzalez, and as always, it is with deep joy and gratitude that I want to thank you for listening to Spiritual Storytelling.